My partner and I affirm the resolution that resolved all drugs in the United States should be legalized. We have 3 reasons why we think this is a good idea. First is for economic reasons, the second is for health reasons, and the third is for violence reasons. Our first argument is that legalizing drugs in the United States would garner the U.S. a significant amount of revenue. According to Blashkos, a reporter for International Business Times, a business journalist for the past 21 years in New York, in an article titled The Pros and Cons of Drug Legalization in the U.S. from October 19, 2010, quoting a study done by Jeffrey A. Myron, senior lecturer of economics at Harvard University and a senior fellow at Cato, and Catherine Waddick, professor of economics at New York University, quote, legalizing drugs would save the government approximately $41.3 billion annually on expenditures related to the enforcement of prohibition. Of those saving, $25.7 billion would accrue to state and local governments, while $15.6 billion would accrue to the federal government, end quote. Drug legalization would also, quote, translate into higher tax revenues generated by the sale of these newly legalized products in the open commercial marketplace. Drug legalization would yield tax revenues of $46.7 billion annually, assuming legal drugs were taxed at rates comparable to those of alcohol and tobacco, they said. Approximately $8.7 billion on this revenue would result from the legalization of marijuana, $23.6 billion from legalization of cocaine and heroin, and $4.5 billion from the legalization of other drugs, end quote. Especially considering the current economic downturn and the current government shutdown, these are economic benefits we can't afford to lose. Our second argument is that legalizing drugs in the United States would garner health benefits by decriminalizing it. Drugs would be treated as a health issue instead of a criminal issue, therefore resulting in better off treatment. According to John Goodman, President and CEO of the National Center for Political Analysis, in an article entitled The Case of Legalizing Drugs on June 28, 2013. This stops the stigma associated with drugs by making it not a criminal issue anymore. This is the only way to ensure effective rehab facilities and effective anti-drug policies. Our third argument is that legalizing drugs in the U.S. would solve issues surrounding drug violence. According to the same article by John Goodwin, quote, the U.S. spends more than $40 billion each year on drug prohibition. But this is just an explicit cost. The implicit costs increased violence, otherwise productive citizens in prison, perpetual poverty, both at home and especially abroad, end quote. The amount of people who are killed and punished and pushed into poverty because of other drug wars at home in various countries in Central and Southern America is obscene and not acceptable. Legalizing drugs like marijuana also results in less revenue for Mexican drug cartels, according to the article by Gosh cited above. Mexican drug cartels also commit significant amounts of violence upon innocent individuals who do not deserve the violence inflicted upon them. We think this violence is messed up and should be stopped immediately. Thus, my partner and I believe we the United States, should legalize all drugs.
Chris and I resolved that drugs should not be made legal in the United States. I will isolate a few reasons why this is true. Heroin and cocaine are bad. According to LifeScience.com, 250,000 deaths worldwide due to illicit drug use in 2004, compared with 2.25 million due to alcohol and 5.1 million due to tobacco. These drugs have little to no medical necessity and are used almost exclusively for recreation. This recreational use will increase easily once the drug is legalized because people of all age groups and of varying relationships to drugs will have access to these drugs. This means that people with little or no tolerance will easily become addicted to the drugs. Even though legalization might open opportunities for treatment, it will exponentially increase the need for treatment because more people will need treatment. Treatment is usually encouraged as an alternative to going to jail or being prosecuted. In a world where there is no law to prosecute drug abuse, then what will encourage the abusers to seek help? When the addiction becomes too much, when their crime is no longer punishable, there will be nothing to encourage these people to seek help. This is the biggest problem with the argument that legalization helps treatment because it ignores the necessity of actually getting people into treatment before they can be treated. People justify drug legalization because of the economic benefits. But I ask you, how much is a person's life worth? What price can be put on the needle-pricked arms and the loss of friends and family? Legalizing drugs will strain our economy more than proponents of legalization like to admit. Legalizing drugs will increase the proportion of society that are addicted to these drugs, meaning these people will not be able to remain employed. That means more people on welfare and more people not paying back loans, mortgages, or taxes. Besides, the economic issues related to single individuals, many individuals will also be hurt economically. Medical, police, and fire services will be strained from drug-related activities and crime. For example, what laws dictate who can drive intoxicated from drugs? And what laws can be made to regulate this when it is hard to even measure drug intoxication? When more recreational drug users are experimenting with drugs, and what new drugs will be created that are even worse than cocaine and heroin? All of these rhetorical questions are reasons why our society is simply not ready for drug legalization. Not many believe that legalizing drugs is a question of individual freedom, but it is not that simple. Drug use does not affect only the user. It affects every single person the user knows, employers, friends, parents, and most importantly, children. Children of drug users are most likely to be depressed, have eating disorders, suffer from increased anxiety issues, and become drug users themselves. Besides, these emotional abuses for children are also more likely to be physically abused. Because drugs have violent psychological effects on the users, many children are abused simply because they cannot live under the same roof. Legalizing drugs cannot change the effects, it only stands the chance of increasing these effects.
Lorraine and I again assert that drugs should be made legal in the United States. It's true that heroin and cocaine are used exclusively for recreation and have no medical necessity, but the same stands true for alcohol and tobacco. However, legalizing drugs does not mean that everyone everywhere will suddenly be uncontrollably addicted. The fact that drugs are currently illegal does not mean that people do not have access to it. Currently, people of all age groups have access to drugs through the black market. Legalizing drugs would allow the government to create laws such as those regarding alcohol and tobacco about who can use drugs and where. The need for treatment may increase because people will be encouraged to seek help when drugs are legal rather than having to hide their problem. The current illegality of drugs encourages death rather than treatment, therefore legalizing drugs and increasing treatment will save lives. Legalizing drugs does not mean that abusers will stop seeking help. This argument is illogical. Do alcoholics feel that they do not need to seek help simply because alcohol is legal? My opponent says that this is the biggest problem with legalization, and yet this problem doesn't really exist. My partner and I are not suggesting that we initiate legalization because we are somehow making money off people dying from drug abuse. No, this too is illogical. Instead, my partner and I are asserting that the money spent per year focused on prosecuting those found with possession of marijuana could instead be focused on our police force and their ability to stop real crimes such as murder or human trafficking, therefore saving more lives. My opponent asserts, in addition to this, my opponent's question of laws that dictate who can drive intoxicated is answered easily. DUIs. They do not exist only for alcohol. Now, my opponent asserts that legalizing drugs will leave many unemployed. Again, my partner and I remind you that alcohol is legal. Horribly addictive drugs such as cough syrup are legal, and this does not mean that a vast majority of Americans are unemployed. Finally, children of alcoholics are more likely to be depressed, have eating disorders, suffer from increased anxiety issues, and become alcoholics themselves. Because alcohol has violent psychological effects, many children are abused, and yet alcohol is legal in the United States. In conclusion, my partner and I would like to remind you that those who want to can have access to these drugs regardless of legality. Legalizing these drugs merely allows the United States to create laws that regulate its usage.
In response to legalization not leading to rampant addiction, our opponents fail to understand the logical basis. While all drugs are available on black markets, the kinds of people who know how to use and will use these markets are fewer than those who don't. When drugs are legalized, the people suddenly having access to them will create a kid in a candy store scenario. This leads to abuse and addiction through ignorance. With no deterrence like jail, drugs can be abused. The idea that because drugs are legal, people choose death over rehabilitation is ridiculous. Being addicted to a drug is not a crime. Possessing it is. There is no criminal consequence for seeking rehabilitation for a legal drug, only a social one. Because of this, legalization will not lead to any greater rehabilitation participation. Furthermore, the resolution will remove society's rehab requirement. The opponent team has accepted that those addicted to drugs require rehabilitation, so why make it even slightly easier to get addicted? It only harms society. We reject that drug legalization will not lead to more unemployment. While it is true that recreational drugs, such as alcohol and prescription drugs, such as cough syrup, lead to addiction, these substances create unemployment on their own. So the number of unemployment from abusing legal drugs would become supplemented with those who are unemployed with those who are unemployed as a result of such drugs as cocaine and methamphetamine. Moving on, evidence of a drug with large negative social effects, like alcohol, being legal is not evidence that we should legalize other potentially horrible and damaging drugs. Following this logic, it's legal to own assault rifles which kill, so it is therefore acceptable to own explosives and thermite and any other lethal method or material. In conclusion, the negative effects on individuals and society, coupled with the economic threats to the country, far outweigh any slight revenue that might be accrued. We need to cut society's desire for drugs, not give them to them.